Lucretius could not credit centaurs, wrote William Empson. Such bicycle he deemed asynchronous. We run into a problem if one of Lucretius's major influences is himself a centaur. Yet that is Jaeger's claim about Empedocles, that prodigious union of Ionian elemental physics and Orphic theology. The split does seem monstrous. On the one hand, Empedocles is the author of a rational, reductivist account of the natural world, which explains all natural phenomena in terms of the combination and separation of four fundamental substances, the roots or elements, under the influence of the two fundamental forces, love and strife. On the other hand, Empedocles declares himself a god, admits to having being two genders, and at least three species, thinks that all sexual relations are incestual, and warns all mankind to abstain from eating meat, laurel leaves, and beans. There are three ways of explaining this interpretative monster. First, we may suppose that Empedocles recognized the contradictory nature of his theories, but consoled himself by remembering that there exists by nature an unbridgeable gulf between the tenets of faith and the conclusions of reason. But the conceptual world of 5th century BC Greece had no room for an Averroes, and had a single standard of truth, as did Empedocles, who uses the same word, pistis, uniformly to denote conviction in both his physical and his religious views. That is, if the last distinction is one that we can maintain. The second option has more scholarly clout. Since all we have are fragments with little indication in the sources as to their ordering in Empedocles' original text, it may be that we have missed an overall pattern that would help explain what seems to be a flat contradiction. Diels and Wilamowitz separated the fragments into a physical poem called On Nature and a religious poem called Purifications, and then interpreted this last as a late work produced after exile and experience had led the poet to abandon his earlier cosmological certainty. But much the same evidence can be used to destroy this second view and construct a third, that there is in fact no contradiction between the physical and religious parts of Empedocles' thought, and further that Empedocles' thought does not even break down into physical and religious divisions in the first place, but is instead one seamless physio-religious whole. There is a soft version of this view argued by Kant, where it is stressed that the theories propounded in the two poems are not contradictory but interdependent, or at least rest on the same foundation. And there is a hard version of this view argued by Osborne, that there are no two theories to be reconciled, since all the fragments come from a single unified poem. I shall be arguing for the hard version of this view. But first a query and a warning. The query is, if there is no contradiction in the fragments, why have we seen one for so long? Why did Diels and Wilamowitz see one? The answer is that their intellectual context led them to expect a clash between scientific and religious views, and the warning is for us not to make the same assumption. There are two things we have not understood very well. The first is that the uniform methods of science do not lead to uniform conclusions. This the history of science will sufficiently attest. It is perfectly possible to reach what a modern scientist might consider mystical views by strict application of a rigorously rationalistic method, as Descartes did. The second idea we have trouble with is that religious and specifically moral views should influence and even be integrated into our view of the physical universe. But even this view is not so far away as we think. It's the soul that's the arbiter of cosmic forces, said Chesterton in 1905. And it is the religious viewpoint which may provide the most useful entrance point to Empedocles' conception of the universe. I shall first argue briefly here for the unity of Empedocles' thought, irrespective of whether he wrote one poem or two. Both the spirit of Empedocles' fragments and their philosophical content resist a division into incompatible physical and religious outlooks. For the religious spirit of even the most reductivist fragments, we need only turn to fragment 6. Hear first the four roots of all things, bright Zeus, life-bringing Hera, Aidoneus, and Nestus, whose tears are the source of mortal streams. Empedocles has chosen to refer to his four roots as divinities rather than substances. And the appeal to the much-wooed, fair-armed virgin muse in fragment 3 reminds us that this inquiry is conceived, like that of Parmenides, as proceeding under the guidance of a goddess. For the religious content of Empedocles' cosmological theories, even when the religious fragments have been excluded from the cosmology to the best of the editor's ability, we need only remember that the physical poem probably ended with a description of a divinity in fragment 134, seen as a sacred and surpassing mind darting through the whole world with his rapid thoughts. And we should remember that the process which leads to this end is that instigated and overseen by a divinity, love, whom no mortal man has discerned, fragment 17. I shall now argue that there was in fact only one poem. The salient fact is that there is no reference in any ancient source that Empedocles wrote two books. This is the inference of modern scholars. I will make three further points. First, it is important to show that there is no serious obstacle in the fact that ancient writers refer variously to Empedocles' On Nature, Pediphuseos, and Empedocles' Purifications, Kathormoi. A single work by Empedocles may have been known by two titles. We know that the same work by Protagoras was known by the separate titles Aletheia and Katabalontes, because two different authorities, Sextus Empiricus and Plato, refer to it by title and then quote an identical opening line. But no two authorities quote the same opening line of Empedocles' poem and refer to it by two different titles. That coincidence of evidence may just be lacking in Empedocles' case, though his situation may be that of Protagoras. Even if Empedocles' poem did have a single well-known title, it is difficult to establish which of Pediphuseos and Kathormoi was that title, or whether neither of them was, since the ancient texts have no way, such as our capitals, italics, and inverted commas, of identifying titles. The book On Nature, as opposed to descriptions of works, the book on nature. Examination of the sentences in which the so-called titles occur show that there are, however, a number of instances where the word kathormoi is used unambiguously as a title and would therefore be capitalized and put into inverted commas in a translation. But if there is a work entitled kathormoi, there may still not be one entitled Periphuseos. Our suspicions should be roused since Periphuseos was the habitual ancient label for a philosophical treatise. And our feeling that this is not a title is strengthened when we see that an alternative label for a work of natural inquiry, Phusika, has also been used 10 times. So there may have been a single work entitled Purifications, and often referred to as Empedocles' book on nature. The second point I shall make is that one traditional defense of the view that there are two poems has problems. This defense states that the physical fragments are addressed in the singular to Pausanias, a disciple of Empedocles, and that the religious fragments are addressed in the plural to the citizens of Akgragas. The evidence does not support such a simple dichotomy, since in fact there are several different addressees in the fragments, such as the Muse in fragments 3 and 131, or mortals in general in fragment 124. In fact, only two fragments are certainly addressed to the citizens of Akgragas, fragments 112 and 114. And even then, fragment 114 is not secure beyond doubt. It begins, O Philoi, as O friends, as does 112, but then goes on to make points not specifically about the men of Akgragas, but about mortals in general. The evidence usually relied upon by those who claim this dichotomy as evidence for two poems is the following passage in Diogenes Laertius, which follows a mention of Pausanias. This Pausanias was, according to Aristippus and Satyrus, Empedocles' beloved, and it was to him that he addressed the work on nature, ta periphuseos, in this way. But you, Pausanias, listen, son of the wise Anchitos. This does not establish that there was a single addressee of Empedocles' tract. It says only that the work as a whole was dedicated to Pausanias. There may have been, I think the fragments show there were, other minor addressees. Is this over subtle? No. There are important ancient parallels where one major dedicatee must share the spotlight of the vocative with other addressees. In Pindar's first Pythian, Hieron is the major figure, but Zeus is also apostrophized, as is Apollo and the Muse. And crucially, Lucretius's poem has Memmius as its principal addressee, but his name occurs only 11 times in the whole work, and these mentions are confined to books 1, 2, and 5. There are 2 references to Memmius in the third person in the opening book, where 49 lines are directly addressed to Venus. Book 3 opens with an address to Epicurus, Book 6 has another address to the Muse, and the proem of Book 2 apostrophizes all mortal men and their folly. It is worth setting out in detail the evidence that Lucretius's masterpiece might have yielded fragments, if lost, might have yielded fragments very like those of Empedocles. And scholars might have grouped them into 2 poems addressed to Memmius on the one hand and Venus on the other. But the more concrete point is that Lucretius took Empedocles as a major model. He may have taken his title from a phrase in the Suda describing Empedocles' poem as periphuseos ton onton, and he does not consistently address a single dedicatee. The third and final argument I shall make is that a certain passage in Plutarch's De Exilio is difficult to explain without assuming that Empedocles wrote only one poem. Plutarch prefaces some lines of Empedocles with the words, Empedocles, giving an introductory account at the start of his philosophy in Arche tes Philosophias, says, there is an oracle of necessity. The lines then quoted from fragment 115 concern the pollution of daimones and their banishment for sin. Tes Philosophias is a phrase referring to a single poem, and probably to a scientific one. But in that case, why is it that its opening sequence discusses spirits in exile? The only answer is that the poem did open with this religious tone, and that it was also a physical or scientific poem. So now that we've established that Empedocles' thought was unified and expressed in a single work, the next question is, what did Empedocles think? So here follows a brief survey of his thought. We begin at the basic constituents of things. We may note that the joint influences of Parmenides and the Milesians. Parmenides had convincingly rejected coming into being, ceasing to be, and change on the grounds that those entailed the concept of non-existence, which was both unthinkable and inexpressible. Note how Empedocles makes a similar double point when he recaps Parmenides' thesis in fragment 12. It is impossible for there to be a coming into existence from what is not, and for what exists to be completely destroyed. It is impossible for there to be a coming into existence from what is not, and for what exists to be completely destroyed. This cannot be fulfilled, nor is it to be heard of. There follows another echo of Parmenides when Empedocles admits that we do talk about change and birth and death, and indeed that even he has to talk about them, but that, like Parmenides' reliable path of opinion, we are simply using names for convenience, and these names reflect no deeper truth. Fragment 9. When there has been a mixture in the shape of a man which comes to the air, ... These terms are not right, but I follow the custom and use them myself. So why were these 4 roots and not some other numbers and not some other number of roots? And why earth, water, air, and fire and not some other things? Here we perhaps glimpse the influence of Pythagorean number mysticism, in which 4, as the smallest square number, was a symbol of justice. We certainly do feel the influence of the Milesian principle of explanatory economy, and of the Milesian idea that theories should not contradict the evidence of our senses. For the elements can indeed be sensed in the substances of the natural world. When we see, for example, the sun with its radiant appearance and pervading warmth, heavenly bodies bathed in heat and shining light, rain everywhere dark and chill, and earth the basis of uh, firmly rooted solids, fragment 21. But though Empedocles has explained all birth, death, and change in terms of the mingling and separation of the roots, he still requires a motive force, such as Anaxagoras' Dine, instigated by Nous, a motive force for this mixing and separation. And he finds that the terms of human relations well describe a physical feature of the universe, that we should not grudge him and we should not grudge him the metaphor, since philia and nikos, love and strife, are perhaps not worse ways of talking about the cosmos than the strong force and the weak force that we use. But these are impersonal physical processes, although Empedocles may feel an entirely appropriate religious awe in front of them. Love is, in fragment 17, Aphrodite. No mortal has perceived her as she moves among them, but pay attention to my line of argument, which will not mislead you. Strife is the name of the force that separates unlike substances, and as fragment 22 says, in the same way, those things that are more ready to combine are more similar, are made similar by love and feel ritual affection. These opposing forces of love and strife lead to a double alternating universe which collapses from unity into plurality and then gathers itself up again into a unity. As Empedocles puts it in fragment 17, at one time it grew to be one only from many, and at another time again it divided to be many from one. There is a double birth of the mortal and a double passing away, and these things never cease their continual exchange of position. At one time all coming together through love, at another again being borne away by strife's repulsion. As we progress from the simple objects of what we would call physics to the more complex formations of chemistry and biology, Empedocles' world becomes somehow less foreign. The fragments are full of insight, as in fragment 96, and the kindly earth received into the broad hollows of the night parts 2 of the brightness of Nestus and 4 of Hephaestus, and these came to be white bones, marvelously held together by the gluing of harmony. Aristotle was not the last to admire this recognition that it is not so much stuff as the particular proportions and combinations of stuff that can construct the fabric of our natural world. In modern chemistry, elements are held together in combinations not because of any extraneous force, but because their forms allow them to combine in a certain stable way. That may be something like Empedocles' gluing of harmony. And there's a flash of biology, modern biology, in a report Aristotle makes of Empedocles' thought in the Physics. Wherever all the parts come together as though for a purpose, the creatures survived, being organized spontaneously in an appropriate way. Those that did not then died out and continue to do so. Matthew Arnold's reaction to Darwin's Origin of Species was, it's all in Lucretius, and it is very nearly all in Empedocles. The retaining of a teleological simile, as though for a purpose, along with the debunking of teleology full and proper, constant unremitting selection by death, the concept of adaptive fitness, organized in an appropriate way, all of these phrases are very Darwinian. The only problem is that word spontaneous, which may or may not be part of Empedocles' original thought. Without the idea that information about design is inherited and employed by the next generation of creatures, natural selection becomes an unlikely explanation for natural complexity. That there was a single immense creation of forms, which has been pared down ever since, is indeed a silly idea. Why then do all creatures appear to be so closely related, we might ask? Because Empedocles did believe that all forms of life were related, if only in the sense that many creatures must be adapted to similar tasks. Again, employing Milesian principles of explanatory economy and universality, Empedocles had a single word for the bark of tree and the skin of a grape and an orange peel, and declared, hair leaves the close-packed features of birds and scales on strong limbs. As the same they grow. Fragment 82. Empedocles' science becomes stranger again when we go on to examine his account of perception and thought, which he treats in such a materialistic way that it appears that the observer is actually altered as a result of observation. Perhaps not so strange if we think of it as the reverse of Schrödinger's notion that the observed is altered by observation. To explain how this happens, we should first hold in mind the way the force of love draws together things which are similar and therefore inclined to combination. Then we can understand Empedocles' view of growth, in which food is dissolved into its constituent parts, and in which these constituent parts are then distributed to different parts of the body by the indifferent force of the principle of like to like. Fragment 95. So sweet seized on sweet, bitter rushed to bitter, sharp came to sharp, and hot coupled with hot. And now we can understand how in fragment 109, with earth we perceive earth, with water water, with air divine air, with fire destructive fire, with love love, and strife with baneful strife. There are mental elements within us which draw in impressions from the natural elements around us, presumably somewhat in the manner of Lucretius's simulacra. So it follows that a perceiver will be physically affected by the surroundings he perceives, and also to what he thinks. As fragment 106 has it, human wisdom grows according to what is present. But how can thought be physical? If we remember that Empedocles puts up mental elements to uh, to correspond to the natural elements of the world, and that these mental elements reflect the elemental composition of the real world, then it will be easier to see that the world, taken as a whole, as a combination of the constituent elements, will need a corresponding mixture in the mind. This corresponding mixture is thought, located in the blood, and specifically in the blood in and around the heart. In seas of blood coursing to and fro, there above all is what man calls thought, because for humans blood around the heart is thought. Fragment 105. The mention of seas of blood coursing to and fro, incidentally interesting because of Empedocles' startling switch between the languages of physiology and world processes, reminds us that thought has no single stable location. Though as Theophrastus explains it on the senses, it does have a control nexus. We think chiefly with the heart blood, for there the elements are more fully mingled than in any other part of the body. Empedocles' heart is the center of thought, in the same way that the brain of modern scientists is the center of thought. For thinking is not stable or static even for us. Quite apart from the spatial variation among mental functions taking place, say, in the prefrontal cortex rather than the parietal lobe, there's a sense in which when you step on my toe, that piece of my anatomy has thought. At the very least, it makes a descriptive statement about the unsatisfactory state of the world and issues a volitional statement about whether or not to change it. Every nerve has a certain amount of thought for us. Since nerves form our web of perception, so for Empedocles all blood has a certain amount of thought, since Empedocles explained perception too in terms of blood. Blood flowed back and forth from the skin to the center of thought in the heart, as described in fragment 100, bearing perception's information to the heart and the heart's instructions to the limbs. This consistent or constant wash of blood, why not call it a sea, was powered by the air pumped in and out of the body by respiration. And blood and thought puts us in mind of two things. The first is the idea that all things have a share in thought, fragment 110. The second is the perfected divinity achieved after the combining of all things by love has been completed. It comes into being, according to Empedokles, a God held fast in the close covering of harmony. Two branches do not spring from his back. There are no feet, no swift knees, no organs of sensation, but he is equal to himself in every direction, the same all over, a rounded sphere, rejoicing in encircling stillness. Fragments 20 to 29. Now, Empedokles tells us that this original perfection was shattered by an act of blood, phonos, that pushed the cosmos back into the power of strife. Scholars have seen how this put a moral action at the center of the explanation of the universe's workings, like Adam's fatal act. But I would go further and say that since it is blood that has been shed, this primal act of sin, this falling off from perception, was a thought as well as an act, like Satan's non serviam, which was simultaneously blasphemy and disobedience. And so from original sin, the spirits who live immortally in alien garments of flesh are involved in an unceasing war between love and strife, perfection and division. These are Empedokles' concepts, but it is unsurprising that strikingly similar ideas were to be independently rediscovered in European thought's most controlling mythology. Such a vision seems to say so much about how important, in some sense, we are all, and how unimportant. Close with fragment 2. After observing a small part of life in their lifetime, they are convinced only of that which each has experienced, yet all boast of finding the whole.